Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm, historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. This isn't some fictional scene from a movie. This was reality in the Bohemian Cafés of 1920s Paris, where artistic genius and narcotic addiction danced together in a deadly waltz that would forever change the cultural landscape of the modern world. Have you ever wondered how an entire generation of artists could simultaneously create some of humanity's most brilliant works while slowly destroying themselves with drugs? The answer lies in the shadowy corners of Parisian cafes, where absinthe flowed like water and heroin was as common as coffee. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the romantic notion of the struggling artist. These weren't just creative souls seeking inspiration through chemical means. They were casualties of a perfect storm of post-war trauma, cultural rebellion, and readily available narcotics that turned the City of Light into something far more sinister. Today, I'm going to take you inside the hidden world of heroin havens that masqueraded as artistic sanctuaries. You'll meet the real people who lived this nightmare. Discover how entire cafe cultures became drug distribution networks, and understand why the most creative period in Parisian history was also its most self-destructive. By the end of this journey, you'll see the 1920s art scene in a completely different light. But before we dive into the smoke-filled rooms where dreams went to die, let me paint you the bigger picture of how Paris became the epicenter of both artistic revolution and narcotic devastation. The Great War had ended just a few years earlier, leaving an entire generation scarred and searching for meaning. Young men who had witnessed unimaginable horrors in the trenches returned home only to find that their old lives no longer fit. Meanwhile, a new breed of wealthy Americans was flooding into Paris, escaping prohibition and bringing with them both money and a reckless appetite for excess. This collision of trauma, wealth, and rebellion created the perfect conditions for what would become one of history's most dangerous cultural experiments. The cafés of Montmartre and Montparnasse weren't just serving coffee and croissants. They were dealing in something far more intoxicating and infinitely more destructive. Let me introduce you to Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a 24-year-old painter who arrived in Paris in the spring of 1923 with nothing but a battered suitcase and dreams of becoming the next Picasso. Jean-Baptiste had survived Verdun, but the nightmares followed him to his cramped studio apartment near Sacré-Cœur. Sleep became impossible, so he began frequenting Café de l'Amour, a notorious establishment where the coffee was bitter and the real business happened after midnight. It was here that Jean-Baptiste first encountered the needle, not as a medical instrument, but as a gateway to a world where the screaming in his head finally stopped. The café's owner, a mysterious woman known only as Madame Noire, had connections that ran deeper than anyone suspected. She didn't just serve drinks, she served escape. Within weeks, Jean-Baptiste's artistic output exploded. His paintings took on an otherworldly quality, full of dreamlike imagery and emotional intensity that critics would later call revolutionary. But what they didn't know was that each masterpiece was paid for with a piece of his soul, bought with German-manufactured heroin that flowed through the café like a toxic river. Jean-Baptiste wasn't alone. The café attracted a rotating cast of damaged souls, American heiresses running from conservative families, British poets seeking inspiration, German intellectuals fleeing political upheaval, and French artists trying to forget the war. They came for the atmosphere, but stayed for the drugs. Madame Noire understood something that modern drug dealers still exploit today. Creative people make excellent customers. They have just enough money to maintain a habit, they're naturally inclined toward experimentation, and they rationalize their addiction as necessary for their art. She didn't need to push her product. She simply created an environment where it felt inevitable. The cafe operated on multiple levels. To the casual observer, it was simply another Bohemian gathering place where artists discussed philosophy over wine. But if you knew the right words, the right gestures, the right people, you could access a parallel world where heroin was measured in artistic inspiration rather than grams. Regular customers developed an elaborate code. Ordering the special coffee meant you wanted opium. Asking for sugar with extra sweetness was code for cocaine. But heroin, the most sought-after substance, required the most subtle approach. You simply asked if the painter's supplies were available today. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. These were people who saw themselves as rebels against bourgeois society, yet they were creating their own rigid hierarchy based on drug access and artistic credibility. The deeper into addiction you fell, the more authentic your art was considered. Sobriety became synonymous with selling out. Take the case of Margaret Worthington, a Boston socialite who arrived in Paris in 1924 with a substantial trust fund and romantic notions about supporting struggling artists. She rented a spacious apartment in the 6th arrondissement and began hosting salons where she would showcase the work of promising young painters and writers. Margaret initially saw herself as a patron of the arts, a modern-day Medici, nurturing the next generation of creative genius. She attended gallery openings, purchased paintings from unknown artists, and prided herself on her sophisticated taste.
But sophistication in 1920s Paris meant more than just appreciating cubism or understanding stream of consciousness literature. When Margaret first visited Café de l'Amour, she was introduced to a world where artistic appreciation took on physical dimensions. The paintings on the walls weren't just viewed, they were experienced through chemical enhancement that allegedly allowed deeper understanding of the artist's vision. The poetry readings weren't just listened to, they were felt through substances that supposedly opened the mind to new forms of consciousness. Margaret's transformation was gradual but devastating. She began by occasionally sampling opium during evening salons, telling herself it was research into the artistic process. Within months, she had graduated to heroin, convinced that only through personal experience with the drug could she truly understand the art it inspired. Her apartment became another node in the network of heroin distribution. Artists would arrive ostensibly to show their work, but actually to score drugs. Margaret would purchase their paintings, not because she loved them, but because buying art was how transactions were disguised. A canvas that might be worth 50 francs would sell for 500, with the markup covering the cost of heroin. The genius of this system was its deniability. If questioned by authorities, everyone involved could claim they were simply participating in the legitimate art market. The drugs were incidental, they would argue, just part of the creative atmosphere that made such groundbreaking art possible. But the reality was far darker. Margaret's trust fund was being systematically drained to feed not just her own addiction, but the habits of an entire network of artists and dealers. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Her judgment became compromised, and her apartment transformed from a salon into a shooting gallery disguised as a gallery space. The most tragic aspect was how the addiction affected the art itself. While initial drug use might have enhanced creativity for some artists, prolonged heroin addiction had the opposite effect. The very inspiration that drew artists to the drug eventually disappeared, leaving them creating art solely to fund their next fix. Jean-Baptiste's story illustrates this perfectly. His early heroin-influenced paintings were indeed revolutionary, full of emotional complexity and visual innovation that captured the attention of serious collectors. But as his addiction deepened, his work became increasingly formulaic.
he found himself painting the same dreamlike imagery over and over, not because it expressed his artistic vision, but because those were the only paintings that sold to the drug-using collectors who frequented the cafes. The economic ecosystem was entirely circular and ultimately unsustainable. Artists used drugs to create art, sold art to buy drugs, and attracted buyers who were themselves using drugs to appreciate art. Money flowed in endless loops, but actual value was being destroyed at every step. The art became less innovative, the artists became less capable, and the buyers became less discerning. Meanwhile, Madame Noire and others like her were getting rich by facilitating this destruction. They positioned themselves as cultural facilitators, but they were actually running sophisticated drug operations that used artistic pretension as cover. The cafe provided the perfect front: irregular hours, eclectic clientele, and a culture that celebrated nonconformity made it nearly impossible for authorities to distinguish between legitimate artistic activity and criminal enterprise. The international nature of the clientele also provided protection. When wealthy Americans or British aristocrats were involved, local police were reluctant to investigate too aggressively. Diplomatic complaints could end careers, and there was always plausible deniability about what was really happening in these establishments. This created a sense of invulnerability among the participants that would prove tragically misplaced. They believed their artistic credentials and social connections made them untouchable, failing to recognize that addiction doesn't respect class boundaries or creative talent. By 1925, the network had expanded far beyond individual cafes. What started as scattered pockets of artistic experimentation had evolved into a sophisticated underground economy that stretched across the entire left bank. The heroin trade had found its perfect camouflage in the Bohemian cafe culture, and the results were both magnificent and horrifying. Consider the evening routine at La Chienne Fumée, a cafe that occupied 3 floors of a crumbling building near the Sorbonne. The ground floor maintained the appearance of respectability. Students debated philosophy over cheap wine, tourists sampled authentic French atmosphere, and local intellectuals held court at their regular tables. But as the night progressed and the casual customers departed, the real business began. The second floor, accessible only through a narrow staircase hidden behind a bookshelf, housed what regulars called the laboratory. Here, American expatriate chemist turned dealer Robert Bobby Chen had set up an operation that would make modern drug cartels envious. Bobby had arrived in Paris with legitimate credentials, a chemistry degree from Harvard, and plans to conduct research at the Sorbonne. Instead, he found himself cooking heroin in makeshift labs, using his scientific training to create increasingly pure and potent products. Bobby's customers weren't street addicts desperate for their next fix. They were discerning consumers who demanded quality and consistency. A batch that was too weak would send artists into withdrawal during crucial creative periods. Too strong and valuable customers might overdose before completing commissioned works. Bobby approached drug manufacturing with the same precision he had once applied to legitimate research, keeping detailed notes on potency levels, customer reactions, and optimal dosing schedules.
The third floor of La Chienne served as both gallery and shooting gallery. Paintings hung on walls that had seen countless injections, their colors seeming to shift and dance in the dim gaslight. Artists would arrive with their latest works, hoping to trade canvas for powder. The quality of the art directly determined the quantity of drugs received, creating a perverse market where artistic merit was measured in milligrams of heroin. This system attracted some genuinely talented individuals who might have achieved greatness without chemical assistance. Élise Dubois, a sculptor from Lyon, possessed extraordinary natural ability that had earned her recognition at legitimate galleries across Europe. But the war had killed her fiancé and shattered her faith in traditional values.
She came to Paris seeking not fame, but forgetfulness. Elise's sculptures, created under the influence of heroin, took on qualities that defied conventional artistic categories. Working with clay in a near-trance state, she would spend 18 hours straight shaping figures that seemed to emerge from some collective unconscious. Her pieces captured emotions that viewers couldn't name but immediately recognized. The specific grief of losing someone to senseless violence, the hollow exhaustion of surviving when others hadn't, the desperate hunger for meaning in a world that had revealed its fundamental chaos. Gallery owners noticed Elise's work immediately. Her sculptures sold for unprecedented sums to collectors who claimed they could feel the artist's pain radiating from the clay itself. What these buyers didn't realize was that they were literally purchasing someone else's suffering, commodified and transformed into aesthetic experience through the medium of narcotic addiction. Elise's success created its own trap. Each sculpture required deeper states of heroin-induced dissociation to access the emotional rawness that made her work so compelling. She found herself increasing her doses, not for pleasure, but for artistic necessity. The drug had become as essential to her creative process as clay or water. Without it, her hands would shake too violently to shape anything. With too much, her consciousness would slip away entirely, leaving her staring at shapeless lumps of clay with no memory of the previous hours. The tragedy was that Elise's addiction coincided with what should have been the peak of her artistic powers. At 28, she possessed both the technical skill and emotional depth necessary for masterpiece creation. Instead, she was trapped in a cycle where each artistic triumph required a level of drug use that made the next triumph less likely. Meanwhile, the financial mechanics of the heroin cafe network were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Transactions were rarely conducted with simple cash exchanges. Instead, an elaborate barter system had emerged, where art, drugs, sex, and social connections were traded in complex multi-party arrangements that made tracking nearly impossible. A typical transaction might involve an American heiress purchasing a painting for an inflated price, with the excess money used to buy heroin that would be shared with the artist and several intermediaries. The heiress would gain social credibility by supporting avant-garde art. The artists would fund both addiction and basic living expenses, and the dealers would profit while maintaining plausible deniability about their actual business. These arrangements were facilitated by figures like Henri Lost, a former banker who had discovered that his financial expertise was perfectly suited to managing drug distribution networks. Henri never touched heroin himself, viewing addiction as bad business practice, but he understood how to structure transactions that satisfied everyone's needs while minimizing legal exposure. Henri's success attracted imitators throughout the Latin Quarter. By 1926, at least a dozen cafes were operating similar schemes, each with its own specialty and clientele. Café Noir focused on serving wealthy tourists seeking authentic Bohemian experiences. Laura Blanc catered to established artists who could afford higher quality drugs. Chez Fa specialized in opium for customers who preferred that drug's more languid effects. Competition between these establishments sometimes turned violent. When Café Désir Maudit began offering higher purity heroin at lower prices, threatening Henri's market share, a mysterious fire destroyed their kitchen and forced them to close for months. When Latim Moore started recruiting Henri's best customers with promises of exotic new drug combinations, several of their regular patrons suffered near-fatal overdoses that scared away other potential clients. The violence was usually subtle, disguised as accidents or coincidences, but participants understood the message. The Heroin Café network had become too profitable and too well established to tolerate significant disruption. Anyone threatening the system would face consequences that extended far beyond simple business competition. This atmosphere of barely controlled chaos attracted a particular type of personality. People drawn to the heroin cafes weren't just seeking drugs or art, they were seeking danger itself. The possibility of overdose, arrest, financial ruin, or violent retaliation added an element of excitement that made the experience more compelling than simple drug use or artistic appreciation alone. American expatriate writer Jonathan Hayes embodied this attraction to risk. Hayes had inherited substantial wealth, but found conventional life unbearably boring. He came to Paris not to write the great American novel, but to live dangerously enough that he would have something worth writing about. The heroin cafes provided exactly the kind of authentic peril he craved. Hayes began frequenting Café de la Nifre, where he quickly established himself as someone willing to take risks that frightened even seasoned addicts.
He would inject unknown substances, participate in dangerous drug combinations, and involve himself in increasingly volatile business arrangements between dealers and artists. His writing, produced in brief periods of clarity between binges, captured the authentic texture of addiction with a precision that made his work essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the period. But Hayes's appetite for danger eventually exceeded even his considerable resources. He became involved in a scheme to smuggle heroin from Germany using hollow picture frames, a plan that required him to transport drugs across international borders while maintaining his cover as a legitimate art collector. The profits would have been enormous, but the risks included not just imprisonment, but execution if caught by authorities who were becoming increasingly aggressive about international drug trafficking. Hayes' story illustrates how the heroin cafe culture had evolved beyond simple addiction or artistic experimentation. By the mid-1920s, it had become a complex ecosystem where people used drugs, art, and danger as interchangeable currencies in transactions that satisfied needs far more complicated than simple chemical dependency. The most sophisticated participants understood that they weren't just buying drugs or selling art. They were purchasing experiences that couldn't be obtained through conventional means. The thrill of transgression, the intimacy of shared secrets, the satisfaction of belonging to an exclusive community that operated by its own rules. The heroin was often less important than the ritual surrounding its use, the social connections it facilitated, and the identity it provided to people who felt disconnected from mainstream society. This psychological dimension made the cafe network far more addictive than the drugs themselves. People who successfully overcame their chemical dependencies often found themselves unable to stay away from the social environment where those dependencies had flourished. The cafes offered not just heroin, but a complete alternative reality, where conventional morality, social expectations, and economic relationships were suspended in favor of more immediate and intense forms of human connection. The tragedy was that this alternative reality was ultimately unsustainable. The financial arrangements were too complex, the legal risks too high, and the physical toll too severe for the system to continue indefinitely. By 1927, cracks were beginning to show throughout the network as overdoses increased, money ran out, and authorities began to take notice of what was happening in the supposedly innocent artistic cafes of the left bank. The first major crack appeared in the form of Detective Inspector Claude Bertrand, a methodical man who had spent 20 years building cases against Paris's most elusive criminals. Bertrand wasn't particularly interested in artistic movements or Bohemian culture, but he was very interested in the sudden spike in overdose deaths among wealthy foreigners.
when the American embassy began pressuring French authorities to investigate the deaths of 3 expatriate heiresses within a single month, Bertrand found himself assigned to a case that would consume the next 2 years of his life. Bertrand's initial investigation revealed what appeared to be a series of tragic coincidences. Young, wealthy individuals with artistic interests were dying from what seemed to be accidental drug overdoses. The deaths occurred in different locations, involved different substances, and appeared to have no connection beyond the victim's shared interest in avant-garde culture. But Bertrand had learned to distrust coincidences, especially when they involved large sums of money and international borders. His breakthrough came through the most unlikely source, a 70-year-old concierge named Madame Paty, who worked at a residential hotel near the Panthéon. Madame Paty had been cleaning rooms and watching tenants for 5 decades, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was amiss. She approached Bertrand with concerns about one of her long-term residents, a young German artist named Klaus Weber, who had been living at the hotel for 18 months. Klaus had initially impressed Madame Paty as a serious, dedicated artist who paid his rent promptly and kept his studio space meticulously clean. But over the past 6 months, his behavior had changed dramatically. He would disappear for days at a time, return looking haggard and disoriented, then spend entire weeks locked in his room with visitors coming and going at all hours. The visitors were always well-dressed, often foreign, and they carried packages that seemed too valuable for legitimate art supplies. When Bertrand examined Klaus's hotel registration, he discovered discrepancies that suggested false documentation. Further investigation revealed that Klaus Weber was actually Wilhelm Richter, a former German army medic who had deserted during the final months of the war. Wilhelm possessed medical knowledge that made him valuable to the heroin distribution network, but his illegal status in France made him vulnerable to blackmail and coercion. Bertrand approached Wilhelm carefully, recognizing that fear rather than greed was likely motivating his involvement in the drug trade. During a series of clandestine meetings in small cafés far from the artistic quarter, Wilhelm gradually revealed the structure and scope of what he called the machine, a distribution network that used artistic culture as both camouflage and customer base. Wilhelm's medical training had made him indispensable to dealers who needed someone capable of treating overdoses without involving legitimate doctors. He had learned to revive unconscious addicts, manage withdrawal symptoms, and even perform minor surgery on customers who had suffered injuries during drug-related accidents. His services were paid for it not with money, but with protection from authorities who might investigate his immigration status. Through Wilhelm's testimony, Bertrand began to understand how the café network operated as an integrated system rather than a collection of independent establishments. Each café specialized in serving different segments of the market: wealthy tourists, established artists, young bohemians, and international dealers. But they all shared suppliers, enforcement mechanisms, and money laundering operations that made the entire network more resilient than any individual component. The key insight was that legitimate art sales were being used to disguise drug transactions on an industrial scale. A painting that might legitimately sell for 100 francs could be purchased for 1,000 francs, with the extra 900 francs representing payment for heroin. The buyer received both artwork and drugs. The seller received both money and social credibility as a successful artist, and the dealer received a commission that was nearly impossible for authorities to trace. This system had created artificial inflation in the Parisian art market that was distorting cultural values throughout the city. Young artists found themselves unable to sell work through legitimate channels because collectors were primarily interested in drug-facilitated transactions. Established artists watched their market values fluctuate based not on artistic merit, but on their willingness to participate in narcotic distribution. Gallery owners faced pressure to either join the network or lose access to the most financially attractive customers. The autumn system had created a perfect storm of danger for both consumers and producers. Young artists were risking everything for a chance at success in a system that replaced artistic merit with financial opportunity. Established artists found themselves trapped in webs of dependency that extended far beyond chemical substances.
Bertrand's investigation revealed that the corruption extended far beyond artistic circles. Bank officials were facilitating international money transfers that funded drug purchases. Shipping companies were transporting heroin concealed in legitimate art shipments. Even some embassy staff were involved, using diplomatic immunity to move drugs and money across borders without customs inspection. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast that Bertrand initially doubted his own findings. How could such an extensive criminal operation exist in plain sight without attracting official attention? The answer lay in the social status of the participants and the cultural prestige associated with supporting avant-garde art. Police were reluctant to investigate activities that involved prominent citizens engaged in what appeared to be sophisticated cultural patronage. Meanwhile, the human cost of the network was becoming impossible to ignore. The overdose death that finally triggered serious official action involved Constance Fairfax, daughter of a British member of Parliament and heir to a shipping fortune. Constance had arrived in Paris 6 months earlier with plans to study at the Sorbonne and support promising young artists. Her body was discovered in a studio apartment in Montmartre, surrounded by paintings she had purchased for prices that investigation revealed were 10 times their legitimate market value. Constance's death was particularly tragic because she had been attempting to leave the Heroin Café scene when she overdosed. Letters found in her apartment revealed her growing awareness that she was being manipulated by dealers who viewed her wealth as a resource to be systematically extracted. She had begun refusing to purchase overpriced artwork and had cut off financial support to several artists whose primary talents seemed to be consuming expensive drugs. Her final letter, addressed to her father but never sent, described her realization that the Bohemian culture she had admired from afar was actually a sophisticated trap designed to separate wealthy young people from their money. She wrote about artists who created mediocre work but commanded high prices because they could provide access to heroin, dealers who posed as cultural sophisticates while running criminal enterprises, and cafe owners who facilitated the destruction of everyone who entered their establishments. But Constance's attempt to extract herself from the network had made her dangerous to people whose livelihoods depended on maintaining the system's secrecy. Her overdose occurred just days before she was scheduled to return to London, where she planned to warn other wealthy families about the dangers their children faced in Parisian artistic circles. The timing suggested that her death might not have been accidental, though proving deliberate murder would require evidence that Bertrand was struggling to obtain. The investigation of Constance's death revealed the network's most sinister aspect: systematic targeting of vulnerable, wealthy individuals who could be manipulated into funding the entire operation. Dealers had developed sophisticated profiles of ideal customers, focusing on people who possessed substantial financial resources but lacked emotional stability or strong family connections that might interfere with exploitation. Young people recovering from war trauma were particularly valuable targets. Their psychological wounds made them susceptible to addiction, while their social status provided protection from law enforcement. Dealers would identify promising prospects through a network of informants in hospitals, universities, and social clubs, then orchestrate seemingly accidental encounters in artistic venues where initial drug experimentation could be presented as sophisticated cultural exploration. The process was gradual and carefully managed.
A wealthy young person might spend months attending cafe events, purchasing reasonably priced artwork, and developing relationships with artists and intellectuals before being introduced to drugs. By the time chemical dependency developed, they were already emotionally invested in the community that supplied their addiction. Leaving meant abandoning not just drugs, but their entire social identity and support network. This psychological manipulation was more effective than simple coercion because it created willing participants who defended the system even as it destroyed them. Artists genuinely believed they were creating revolutionary work. Buyers convinced themselves they were supporting important cultural movements, and dealers maintained that they were facilitating artistic innovation rather than running criminal enterprises. The self-deception was reinforced by the undeniable fact that some genuinely important art was being created within the network. Several artists whose work was later recognized as historically significant had indeed produced their best pieces while using heroin obtained through cafe connections. This created enough legitimate artistic achievement to provide credible cover for the broader criminal enterprise. Vincent Marot, Jean-Baptiste's younger brother, exemplified this tragic complexity. Vincent had followed Jean-Baptiste to Paris in 1925, hoping to pursue his own artistic ambitions while helping his brother recover from what their family believed was simple war-related drinking problem. Vincent discovered that Jean-Baptiste's issues extended far beyond alcohol, but he also witnessed his brother creating paintings of extraordinary emotional power and technical innovation. Vincent found himself torn between concern for Jean-Baptiste's health and admiration for his artistic output. The heroin was clearly destroying his brother's body and mind, but it was also unlocking creative capabilities that seemed impossible to achieve through conventional means. Jean-Baptiste's heroin-influenced paintings were selling to serious collectors and receiving attention from legitimate critics who had no knowledge of the drugs involved in their creation. This dilemma drove Vincent to begin his own experimentation with heroin.
Initially as research into his brother's creative process, but eventually as an end in itself. Vincent's artistic abilities were less developed than Jean-Baptiste's, but heroin provided access to emotional states and visual perceptions that enhanced his work beyond his natural capabilities. Within months, both brothers were trapped in a cycle where artistic identity and chemical dependency had become inseparable. Their story illustrates how the cafe network corrupted not just individuals, but entire families and social connections. People who arrived in Paris with intentions of helping addicted relatives often became addicts themselves, drawn into a community where drug use was normalized and even celebrated as evidence of artistic authenticity. The economic pressures made escape nearly impossible. Artists who tried to quit heroin discovered that their work produced during sobriety was unmarketable to the collectors who had previously supported them. Gallery owners lost interest in clean artists whose work lacked the intensity that drug use had provided. Social connections evaporated as former friends viewed sobriety as betrayal of shared values and experiences. By late 1927, the network had reached a level of integration and sophistication that made it almost indistinguishable from legitimate cultural institutions. Several cafes had expanded into full-scale galleries that mounted serious exhibitions featuring work by both addicted and clean artists. Art critics who were unaware of the drug connections wrote favorable reviews that enhanced the reputation of network-affiliated artists in mainstream cultural circles. The most successful participants had learned to navigate between legitimate and criminal aspects of the art world, using their network connections to advance conventional careers while maintaining access to drugs and the social community that provided them. Some artists were simultaneously represented by respectable galleries and cafe-based dealers, selling different types of work to different markets, depending on whether drugs were involved in the transaction.
This dual existence required constant management of multiple identities and relationships. An artist might spend morning hours creating conventional work for legitimate galleries, afternoon hours producing drug-influenced pieces for café buyers, and evening hours socializing with other addicts, while maintaining the pretense that their gatherings were purely intellectual or artistic in nature. The psychological strain of maintaining these multiple identities often accelerated the descent into deeper addiction. People who might have maintained moderate drug use for years found themselves increasing consumption to manage the anxiety and exhaustion that came from constantly switching between different versions of themselves. Meanwhile, the financial mechanics of the network were becoming so complex that even sophisticated participants lost track of their actual economic situation. Artists might believe they were financially successful based on high prices for their work, without realizing that most of their income was immediately recycled back to drug dealers. Buyers might spend enormous sums thinking they were building valuable art collections, without understanding that the inflated prices made their purchases worthless in legitimate markets. The cafe owners and dealers who controlled the system were the only participants with clear understanding of the actual money flows. They had structured transactions to maximize their own profits while creating illusions of prosperity for everyone else involved. Artists received enough money to maintain their addictions and basic living expenses, but not enough to achieve actual financial independence that might allow them to leave the network. Buyers received enough social status and access to exclusive experiences to justify their expenditures, but not enough genuine artistic value to make their purchases worthwhile investments. The system was designed to keep everyone dependent on continued participation, with no clear exit strategy for anyone except the dealers themselves. This economic trap was reinforced by social and psychological dependencies that made leaving the network feel impossible, even for people who recognized its destructive nature. The cafe community provided not just drugs and art, but friendship, intellectual stimulation, sexual opportunities, and social identity that participants couldn't easily replace through conventional means. For many people involved, the network had become their entire world. Their friends were other participants, their romantic relationships were formed within the community, their living situations were arranged through network connections, and their daily routines revolved around cafe schedules and drug availability. Leaving meant abandoning not just addiction, but every meaningful relationship and social connection they had developed in Paris. The isolation was particularly severe for foreign participants who had few connections outside the artistic community. American expatriates who had burned bridges with their families to pursue Bohemian lifestyles found themselves trapped in Paris with no support system beyond the network that was destroying them. British aristocrats who had scandalized their social circles by embracing avant-garde culture couldn't return home without admitting the extent of their involvement in activities that would disgrace their families. As 1928 approached, the network was approaching a crisis that would ultimately lead to its destruction. The combination of increased police attention, mounting overdose deaths, and financial unsustainability was creating pressures that the system couldn't absorb indefinitely. But the participants were so deeply embedded in the network's social and economic structures that recognizing the approaching collapse required a level of clarity that chronic drug use made nearly impossible to achieve. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the forces trying to preserve the network and those working to destroy it. With the lives and artistic legacies of hundreds of people hanging in the balance, the crisis began with a single photograph that would change everything. In February 1928, a freelance journalist named Paul Durand stumbled into Café des Rêves Perdus at 3 in the morning, seeking shelter from a violent rainstorm. What he witnessed in that smoke-filled room would expose the dark heart of Parisian Bohemian culture to the world. Durand had his camera with him, a compact Leica that he used for documenting street scenes and architectural details. But the scene that greeted him in the cafe's upper room was unlike anything he had ever encountered. In the corner, a young woman in an expensive silk dress lay unconscious, while a man in a painter's smock ingested something into her arm. At a nearby table, 3 people passed around a needle like it was a communion chalice, their eyes rolled back in chemical ecstasy. The most shocking sight was a teenage boy, no more than 16, methodically preparing heroin, while an older man watched approvingly. The boy's hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. His clothes were expensive, suggesting wealthy family connections, but his face bore the hollow expression of advanced addiction. Durand raised his camera almost instinctively, the flash illuminating the scene for a split second before chaos erupted. Shouts filled the room as people scrambled to hide evidence and escape through back exits.
But it was too late. Durand had captured something that would bring down an empire built on artistic pretension and chemical dependency. The photograph showed more than just drug use. It revealed the systematic exploitation of vulnerable young people by adults who had weaponized artistic culture for criminal purposes. The boy in the image was later identified as Philippe Rothschild, heir to a banking fortune and son of one of France's most prominent families. His presence in the café raised questions that would reverberate through the highest levels of French society. Philippe's story embodied everything tragic about the network's evolution. He had arrived in Paris the previous autumn, ostensibly to study literature at the Sorbonne, but actually to escape a family scandal involving financial irregularities at his father's bank. The 16-year-old possessed both enormous wealth and profound emotional vulnerability, making him an ideal target for the cafe operators who specialized in identifying and exploiting such individuals. His recruitment had followed the established pattern. Initial contact came through seemingly innocent cultural events, where he met charming artists and intellectuals who appeared genuinely interested in his thoughts about literature and philosophy. These new friends gradually introduced him to increasingly exclusive gatherings, where drug use was presented as sophisticated exploration of consciousness rather than simple addiction. Philippe's youth made him particularly susceptible to peer pressure and adult manipulation. The older artists and writers who surrounded him possessed knowledge and experience that he desperately wanted to acquire. When they suggested that true artistic understanding required direct experience with mind-altering substances, he accepted their guidance without question. His financial resources made him valuable beyond his potential. As a simple customer, Philippe had access to banking connections that could facilitate international money transfers, family properties that could serve as storage locations, and social connections that provided entry to circles previously inaccessible to the network. Within months, he had become not just an addict, but an active participant in the criminal enterprise that fed his addiction. The photograph's publication in Le Figaro created a sensation that extended far beyond artistic circles. Philippe's family immediately hired private investigators to determine how their son had become involved in such activities. Other wealthy families began questioning their own children's involvement in Parisian Bohemian culture. Embassy officials demanded explanations for the apparent targeting of their citizens by French criminals. Most damaging was the revelation that the network had been systematically exploiting minors. Philippe was not the only underage participant. Investigation revealed at least a dozen other teenagers from prominent families who had been drawn into cafe-based drug operations. The exploitation of children transformed what had been viewed as adult vice into something far more serious in the eyes of both law enforcement and public opinion. Detective Inspector Bertrand found himself at the center of an international incident as foreign governments demanded action against what they characterized as organized predation on their citizens' children.
The pressure forced French authorities to abandon their previous reluctance to investigate activities involving prominent cultural figures. Resources that had been denied to Bertrand's investigation were suddenly made available, along with diplomatic support for actions that might offend influential people. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically as Bertrand gained access to banking records, shipping manifests, and diplomatic correspondence that revealed the true extent of the network's operations. What had appeared to be a collection of Bohemian cafés was actually a sophisticated international criminal organization that used artistic culture as camouflage for drug trafficking, money laundering, and systematic fraud. The financial analysis was particularly revealing. Over the previous 3 years, approximately 2 million francs had flowed through network-affiliated accounts, representing far more money than could be explained by legitimate art sales. Much of this money had come from wealthy young people like Philippe, whose trust funds and family allowances had been systematically drained to support operations that extended far beyond Paris. Shipping records revealed regular deliveries of art supplies from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland that actually contained pharmaceutical-grade heroin and cocaine. These shipments were coordinated with the arrival of wealthy tourists and expatriates, whose spending patterns had been carefully monitored by network operatives embedded in hotels, banks, and social clubs throughout the city. The most shocking discovery was the extent to which legitimate cultural institutions had been compromised by network activities. Several respected galleries were discovered to have been facilitating drug transactions through art sales. Museum curators had been accepting bribes to provide authentication for works whose values were artificially inflated to disguise drug payments.